We're live streaming as well.
Hello, everyone. We'll be starting in just a couple minutes. Hello, everyone, and welcome. My name is Todd Fernandez with Climate Crisis Policy, and I'll be your host today. Thank you all for joining us to discuss the most important organizing challenge humanity has ever faced: how to unite in common cause, to join as one humanity to protect our sacred planet. In the first session, this is our sixth in 2 days. In the first session, we had a great gathering of elected officials and other leaders who endorsed the idea of a collective comprehensive bill, while also focusing us on more immediate goals. The upshot was an enthusiastic invitation for massive outside pressure. And that's, of course, where we all come in. In session 2, we welcomed a wonderful array of leaders from major environmental and science organizations. And MIT and Project Drawdown offered to host a scientific advisory committee to assess the greenhouse gas impacts of proposed bills. And the group generally agreed that there was a need for greater coalition infrastructure to unite all the various circles, perhaps with a climate congress convening or coalition of coalitions. In session 3, we welcomed a wonderful array of leaders from a variety of areas: farming, environmental justice, unions, teachers, lobbying groups, doctors, indigenous women, and faith. We had a fascinating conversation there about those focuses. In session 4, we had another great group of coalitions, environmental justice and psychiatrists, which we're all going to need to get through this. Session 5, which just finished a little earlier, we had ritual and spiritual enrichment with a wide variety of faith organizations. And we heard about the vast capacity and passion of that wide-ranging faith community focused on climate. And we lit the Hanukkah candle. Happy Hanukkah to everyone. In this session 6, we now welcome the direct action and mass mobilization organizations and inspirations of the movement. Our conversation is still the same, big picture. What is the federal climate legislative strategy in the United States from where you sit? What does that look like? And perhaps more importantly for this session, how do we unite to organize as one? And for us, that's all the direct action groups around the country to be able to mobilize as one. And then what would a comprehensive demand do as a tool to inspire and direct your energies? And would you be interested in being part of a process that was open and inclusive to draft a comprehensive climate bill? By way of comparison, the comprehensive immigration bill is the first priority for President Biden, and that is no accident. A nationwide network led by the U.S. Conference of Catholic Bishops, the ACLU, and state-level coalitions like New York Immigration Coalition, which has 200 members and a 36-person staff, just for that one part of the coalition, made that happen, starting with their push in 2010. I was in that battle for comprehensive immigration reform under Obama, and it was a revelation of organizing infrastructure. We marched on DC multiple times. We protested out Senator Schumer's office, outside his office, to keep the heat on, and he was the lead sponsor. He didn't like it. We toured the state with teach-ins and assemblies to stir up local activism. There was an orchestrated campaign tied to national legislation, and people got arrested in large numbers. They held a fast on the Capitol lawn that went on for days, and Obama and Biden went down to pay homage to these faith leaders holding a fast. So what is our strategic vision here? And how can we link together in a network to have even larger actions with greater targeted impact? So welcome all as we create a plan for unity that will make the scientific solutions politically mandatory by changing the political reality from the outside until we are confident and clear that a new trajectory has been forged for our home, this incredible, miraculous planet Earth, from which all of us and all of nature is born and nourished with abundance. Now is the time for humanity to protect Mother Earth from corporations who threaten all of that. The challenge is not opposition or science, as I see it. It is internal among us, among organizations and activists. If we can unite, everything else is possible. From yesterday, I think there's enough momentum to say that we are going to embark on a process of some kind to draft a comprehensive climate bill together in community. The major Greens, Sierra Club 350, EDF, they were all there and seem to be open to this idea. So the discussion about whether and why to do this is a bit resolved, but I'll just share a little bit about the underlying strategy there. When it comes to strategy, often the debate centers on political pragmatism and an assessment of what's possible if we're counting the votes in the moment without an outside strategy. It also often ends up being an internal compromise before the bill even gets written or the fight begins. So I believe we must write and file the comprehensive gold standard bill to use as a rallying cry for the masses. And by doing so, we will set the goalpost for the dream, the aspiration that will ignite the most passionate activists I've ever met, all of you, including the ACT UP veterans in Rise and Resist. There's, of course, also incremental change we can advance, and that's great. But once we have the big vision, then we can identify that the piecemeal parts that can move faster and check those off the list. But by having both the big picture to mobilize the grassroots and unleash the grassroots and individual bills, we're no longer creating a strategy conflict between these approaches, but rather a synergy that creates unforeseeable, unimaginable possibilities. Another issue that comes up is whether a bill can pass right away. And to that I say, we should file the bills, not that we think that can pass, but the bills with the outcomes that we want, and in this case, need scientifically. Then you organize around those, build your power, and then start counting the votes. The negotiations with Congress at the end of that journey will be very different than they appear today. And ultimately, Congress will make the tough decisions. We don't have to among ourselves. We can have different camps lobbying their passions while we all work together on the big picture. Imagine if all our groups lobbied the same day, if all the social media teams had the same message and same call to action, if all our legislative directors and organizers were working as a team to divvy up the 435 congressional districts, build many coalitions in each one, and go after the votes. Imagine a new world of possibilities, because we have the capacity to do this, and all we need now is the plan, the infrastructure, and the demand. In the first session with Congress, Senator Merkley, Representative Tlaib, and Representative Levin, they all asked for more outside pressure. And I asked them for their short-term legislative plans the next year, and to have an established regular mechanism for updating the movement so we know when to mobilize and for what. Senator Merkley suggested a bicameral team, both houses, that would hold briefings every 3 weeks, like they evidently did for healthcare. And we know what kind of outside pressure was brought there. And I know we just had some great coordination with Protect the Vote. And so I'd love to explore whether that network is available for climate action, and your insights on how that worked in terms of holding both individual local autonomy and collective mobilization, and whether there are models there that might be applicable to building an infrastructure for climate mobilization. Last, I just want to add that I believe that it's critical that this be an open, inclusive, and transparent process of drafting this bill and organizing these coalitions, because how we start off matters, and how a bill is drafted matters. I don't think that inside secret plans and invite-only coalitions will inspire the devotion of the masses. Everyone must be welcomed and included from the outset. As scary as that can be, it's doable with a well-managed process. So I welcome also your thoughts on this concept. It's central because we're aiming to build a real mass movement. We're not aiming to play inside politics but rather to build a community that will then sprint to action out of passion and commitment because they were here from the beginning. So there's no better group of people to talk to about this, obviously. And I welcome you all and thank you all for coming. I'm so happy you're here. It's an honor to be with you. And we'll get started now with going around with the central question: what is the National Climate Legislative Strategy, and how is civil society organized to collectively achieve results? Otherwise put in this context, how can the direct action community be more formally and nationally organized for sustained national action? So it's not all ad hoc, but we're in place and ready to move on our own schedule and then as the urgency requires in Congress. First up, we have Christina C. from Extinction Rebellion NYC. Christina, welcome, and the floor is yours. Thank you for being here.
Thanks for having me, Todd. A little background on XR. It was started at the end of 2018 in the UK and quickly spread around the world. So within the first year, there was 1,100 groups around the world in 70 countries. So it basically took off, and it's created this massive network of, people all over the world, scientists, teachers, lawyers, everyone getting involved, because they totally believe, that we need to be acting like this is an emergency. And this is about 2 years ago when the climate emergency movement was really taking off, that kind of new messaging around the urgency that we need to transform and adapt. And XR has had an effect all around the world and also at home as well. In New York City, we pushed the city to declare a climate emergency, which was the largest city in the world to do so at that point. And we did that by working the inside game with politicians together with strategic direct action on the streets. And we made it happen. We've also taken on the media and pushed them to shift the way they cover climate because they are a huge impact on how we consume what is happening in the world. And we were pointed to by the New York Times as the reason that they exited the Oil and Money Conference that they had been sponsoring for many, many years. So XR is all about mobilizing people, 3.5% of the population, based on Erica Chenoweth's her work. And this is all kinds of people. We're not limiting, to one specific subset of the population because this issue affects all of us. And we can't just make incremental changes. This is a massive overhaul in how we're currently operating as a society today. And as we all know, the US is so polarized at this point, we need to find common ground and cross those political and cultural divides to work together and see, our similarities, that we can't just continue making this divisive. So our goal is to mobilize, but also to shift into a new mindset of systems change and really acknowledging that there is, destruction happening in the world around us, which takes on a whole level of grief. So Todd, you talked about having psychiatrists on a panel earlier, and, obviously COVID is having an effect on all our mental health, but also so is climate change, climate anxiety, all of these issues. So we need to have drastic action, radical drastic action to take place, and for everyone to be on board with it to save what we do have left, because we're facing mass extinction of species, ecosystem breakdown, and we're already seeing disaster capitalism. Did anyone see that water got added to the commodity trading on Wall Street, I think yesterday? And also we've seen how wealth has massively shifted in the midst of the pandemic. So what XR is talking about, we're calling for a citizens assembly, which is able to bring everyone together and really be able to shift the issues with more drastic action than politicians would ever take on their own. And this is a form of deliberative democracy that has been used in Europe already. And it's not just about policy, but it's also about getting the wider population on board with making those drastic shifts. So yeah, I will leave it there.
Thank you, Christina. And, I organized with y'all on the New York Times action. I think that sent a shockwave through the media world, didn't it? And that was fun. That was some good stuff. It wasn't fun being in handcuffs for 3 hours, which was really painful, frankly, for my older joints. And so anyhow, how we deal with the police is actually another topic. We could touch on that later today, actually, if we get into that time frame. All right. Next up, we have Jonathan Walker from Rise and Resist. We invited Rise and Resist to be part of Climate Mondays in 2018. And I just went to them because after the election, I also worked with y'all on the IDC stuff early on. And I just love Rise and Resist because its organizing model is phenomenal. Every Tuesday, for every week since, for 4 years, basically, until we went virtual, and nonstop action at everything. And I'll just say it's really nice to come to an event where I get to speak that I didn't have to organize. Every once in a while that happens. And you know how that goes, to be grateful for that. So anyway, I love you guys. And we did the Chase action together, and the climate group at Rise and Resist is just, unbelievable group of people, and everything is wonderful about it. So Jonathan, please take it away and welcome.
Thank you, Todd. Good to be here. Good to see everyone. John or Jonathan, I use he, him pronouns. Very quickly, and yeah, Todd, as you said, I think almost everybody here we have worked with, we have coalitioned with. That's not a problem for us, coming together. So right off the bat, we're there. Rise and Resist, as Todd said, for years, we came together in the wake of the 2016 election. Core group of people coming from ACT UP primarily, but also Gays Against Guns, a number of other groups. We were a 501c4. We have a mission statement, and I can sort of paraphrase it. We're committed to opposing and disrupting and defeating any government act that threatens democracy, equality, and our civil liberties. And social justice is at the core of our work. And of course, in particular, that's where the environmental climate emergency movement is completely embedded. We had in the first year a very loose-knit environmental group. It kind of faded out because we focused on immigration and on healthcare. And we did a lot of actions in New York, but also in DC, particularly around the dismantling of the ACA. And the current iteration of the Rise and Resist environmental group was put together about a year and a half ago. We sort of brought it together because Rise and Resist has been evolving over the last 4 years. We really sat down and talked policy. And we came to the conclusion that we had to address white nationalism and white supremacy. And we focused there. And of course, that brought us right around within 6 months to 8 months of breakout meetings and a working group talking about social justice, period. And so all our working groups in Rise and Resist. So as Todd said, we meet on Tuesdays. Every Tuesday online, you can go to riseandresist.org to download the link. 7 to 9. And then we have working groups, the disabilities group, the environmental group, the actions group, where we plan a lot of our street actions. We actually have 4 coming up in the next 8 or 9 days on various different issues. And the environmental group rebooted really around social justice. And of course, that incorporates everything from immigration to police brutality, race, healthcare, and it all knits together with the environment. We practice nonviolent, trained civil disobedience and direct action. As Todd said, we worked on the Chase Bank stuff and Jamie Dimon. We were involved in the New York Times action. XR helped us out when we did an action at Bloomberg's Global Climate Forum at the Plaza Hotel in New York, and we shut down Fifth Avenue, and we had over 30 people arrested at that. Cotter's gonna pick up. I brought, or Lori Cotter is here from Rise and Resist. Also, Rise and Resist As we always say, we never get arrested alone. You always bring somebody with you. You always have an affinity group. So Cotter's going to pick it up and talk a little bit about our work as well.
Great. Thank you, Jonathan, and welcome, Lori.
Thanks, Todd and Jonathan. We've talked to Jonathan and I have talked a lot about this, and as he said, there's a specific climate group within Rise and Resist. There's also now a newly formed policy group who's one has an interest in environmental policy and climate policy. So that's, yeah, we're gearing up for a lot, and there are a lot of people in Rise and Resist that one of their main focus is going to be climate. So we're gearing up. COVID be damned, we're going for it. And I think what within the context of what you're talking about, Todd, is that Rise and Resist in some ways is really a service organization. We can provide training, CD training, civil disobedience, marshal training. We can provide marshals. We can help with strategy. We can, especially for groups that might be focused on policy and legislation and aren't really used to a lot of direct action. I think we can be really helpful there in providing the infrastructure and the training to do that. We've done a lot of reactive direct action for things that happen immediately. We've also done long-term campaigns. And we're very comfortable doing all of that. And as many of you know, we're very comfortable working in coalitions where we're comfortable just being part of the infrastructure for an action. And we're comfortable being part of the strategy group to create something. And we're comfortable leading it. So one of the real strengths, I think, of Rise and Resist is our flexibility. And we have, I am an old ACT UP veteran, and there are many there, and there are people that have been doing this and training people to do it for years. And there's plenty, like XR, there's plenty of groups that do it as well, and we can have and will continue to all work together. And most people in Rise and Resist, I can't say everybody, but I would think most everybody is really geared up to work in coalition in general. And climate, I think, has been one of the most successful areas where we have coalitions with other people. And as I said, we bring skills and infrastructure and bodies to whatever needs to be done. And I think we're going to work more. Like I said, we have a policy group that's interested in climate policy. So we're going to keep moving now that some of the pressure of the national government is going to change, that we can really start pushing forward instead of putting out fires, is what I'm trying to say. Instead of just trying to hold the line from everything falling apart, we can actually now start pushing in a much more positive way to get what we want in general.
Wonderful, wonderful. We're going to go around several times, but so one thing I want to have you talk about at some point is the way you run your meetings and how open you are to people just showing up and pitching their outside idea. Gets on the agenda toward the end, and how you endorse and support other outside activities, but then also how egalitarian your internal organizing is. So anyone who wants to do an action can basically do an action and bring it and propose it to the group. They get people gravitate toward it if they like it, and it happens.
Yes. Anybody in the room can suggest, can bring up anything, and whoever's there makes the decision. There's not a hierarchy to go to some board or something and decide it. It's decided in the room with who's there and who suggests it and who wants to do it.
Jonathan?
And we, anybody that comes to a meeting or comes to a working group, and if there's any sort of vote, endorsement, anything like that, if you're there, you can vote. If you're there, you can help plan. If you're, that's the thing. If you're in the room, you go to work. And it doesn't matter. I mean, we ask at the beginning of the meetings, is there anybody here from the press? Is there anybody here from law enforcement? Anybody can say what they want. They can lie if they want, but we just take it from there. And if you're ready, then you put your boots on the ground.
And then they facilitate a very structured meeting that really allows for crowdsourcing of ideas and energy, and no one's making centralized decisions about anything. And I think that's part of the magic of your organization and its durability over time, as being a truly grassroots, non-hierarchical, open and inclusive organizing model. And I think it's one of the best models of grassroots organizing I've ever seen. All right, so before we get too deep in our love fest with Rise and Resist, let's keep moving along. And I just want to tell everybody that we have a new guest joining us, Mario Molino from Protect Our Winners. And thank you so much for joining us, Mario. And we'll take you in turn in a minute. We'll add you in. So next up, we have Roy Barato, who's also with Extinction Rebellion New York, but hailing from Arizona, I think, at the moment. Welcome, Roy, and please, we invite your thoughts.
Hi, thank you. Yes, I'm located right now in Sedona, Arizona, but I, like Christina, was a co-founding member of the New York City chapter of Extinction Rebellion. And I'm also a PhD candidate in the Philosophy and Education program at Teachers College. And so I had a pre-existing and continue to have an existing interest from an academic perspective in abrupt climate breakdown and the Anthropocene broadly. And so when Extinction Rebellion came on the scene, I was motivated to help launch that. It's not really an organization, but movement in the city to the best of my abilities. And Christina spoke well about the sort of history and growth of Extinction Rebellion. So maybe I'll try and focus a little more on your specific questions, Todd. If I recall, it's about the federal strategy, legislative strategy for climate, as well as the sort of integration between that strategy and civil society. And so for myself, I haven't, unfortunately, because I was brought on late to this panel, wasn't able to prepare quite as much as I would have liked. And so I haven't had a chance to look at the bills on the Climate Crisis Policy website in any amount of detail. But I suspect, and please correct me if I'm wrong, there's nothing about a carbon tax in there. And I know also that the Biden administration is resistant to, or will be resistant to, the implementation of a carbon tax, which in my view, within the structure of global petrocapitalism, is the only meaningful policy to reduce carbon emissions in the time frame that, well, even if we could, in the time frame that we need them to be done. Carbon tax is the way to do it, to bring that negative externality back onto the producers of emission, the corporations, Exxon, et cetera. So I would love to hear others' thoughts on that as well. Now, for myself, I'm an anarchist. I think the only solution here is the revolutionary overthrow of the U.S. imperialist state and global capitalism broadly. Absent that, carbon tax is at least taking the matter seriously, in my opinion, within, again, the framework of global capitalism. But again, lacking that, what can civil society do, and what has XR done? As Christina mentioned, in New York City, we organized and exerted pressure upon the New York City Council to pass, along with other groups, of course, to adopt a climate emergency resolution. And I think that something like that synergistic relationship between decentralized, autonomous or semi-autonomous direct action groups like XR, which really is a movement and was meant to be a movement of movements, actually, organizing in that fashion, as we saw sort of spontaneously, of course, through this summer with the Black Lives Matter movement and the defund the police slogan that gained popularity, et cetera, emulating that success perhaps, and pressuring to the best of our abilities our elected officials, who are, in fact, in my view, our enemies, not our allies. You mentioned, Todd, that you had protested Chuck Schumer, even though he was the one sponsoring the bill, and I think that's right, and they don't like that very much. And so we have to be more aggressive, in my view. Civil disobedience is about as polite as we can be at this point. So organizing in that fashion, sustained civil disobedience in a way, nonviolent, of course, in a way that makes it clear that there's no negotiating about the passage of drastic measures, which, of course, I fear anything like a Green New Deal will be watered down, as it already has been since it was taken from the Green Party and sort of diminished by the Democratic Party, will, if it miraculously passes the House, will be blocked by the Senate and will ultimately be vetoed by Biden. That's my fear, and I would love to be persuaded otherwise. So I've kind of lost track of time. I'm sorry if I'm rambling, but I'll stop there.
Thank you, Roy, so much. I just one caveat I forgot to mention earlier. We in this whole symposium, we've done our best to avoid policy discussions. This is more about infrastructure and strategy, macro strategy. Obviously, policy details are an element of any kind of legislative issue and way forward. But for now, it's like, what would a comprehensive bill do as an organizing tool, not what's in the bill. So just want to set that a little bit, because boy, it's quick. We can go down the rabbit hole of policy debates, and we like to have those very structured. And we will be having a whole debate on that topic in December 30th, I think, at our general meeting. And CCL will be there, and Food and Water Watch. So next, I think, well, Mario, we haven't spoken, so I'm going to insert you a little bit before Leslie. And we welcome you to this. I didn't get a chance to debrief with you a little bit at this, but Mario Molina is the ED of Protect Our Winters. And so we're going around for 5 minutes openings, and there'll be a little bell if that you'll hear that's, just to slowly wrap up. It's not a hard cut. And well, I'm just so glad to have you here, because we're talking about mass mobilization and how we can get everybody in the same, mojo. And you have all these outdoor athletes, and I can't imagine what it would be like to mobilize the whole world like that, to all of those groups to join the direct action in an office somewhere with their skis and their, they can trapeze down and whatever else you folks can do. But anyway, we're just happy to have you here. Welcome.
Well, Todd, thank you so very much for having me, and thanks so much for organizing this. I've actually had the chance to join in on a couple of the sessions. I was at Climate Reality for 5 years as their international program director, so it was great to see Ken Berlin earlier on today as well. And since then, as you mentioned, I'm the executive director for Protect Our Winters. We take probably a little bit of we're kind of like the outside kids of the climate movement in a lot of ways. We were founded by Jeremy Jones, who is a big mountain pro snowboarder, and who realized that everything that our community cares about in the mountains, from snowpack to the duration of winter to the stability and the predictability of the outdoor seasons, was under threat. And so it was very endemic to the outdoor sports community. And since then, we've grown to have about 150 elite athletes, ranging from gold medalists to Everest summiteers, and Jimmy Chin, who did Free Solo, the award-winning documentary, as well as 25 outdoor brands, including Patagonia, some of the biggest resorts in the country, like Aspen Ski Co., and now other brands such as Fat Tire and Beer, and Skull Candy and Electronics. So we have a pretty broad coalition outside of what we consider the traditional climate movement. And what we honestly believe is that the environmental movement's done a fantastic job, and all of us here and a lot of the people that you've had on, organizations that I've worked with in the past, we did a really good job at building the core of the climate movement and people who identify as climate activists, as I think most of us on this call and on these calls do. But we've seen that hasn't been enough, and hasn't been enough to generate the political will to drive to the solutions that we're talking about on these calls. And so what we've seen as well is that a lot of the wins and losses are happening at the margins. All we have to do is think back about to 2016 and how many votes that election hinged on, and the consequences of that election. And even as as supportive as we are of the incoming administration, and as hopeful as we are of what can be done at the federal government, we know that we have a split Congress. But the reality as well is, I think we're being a little bit sometimes too optimistic in celebrating what we'll be able to get done in the 117th, unless we're able to actually bring on people from both sides of the aisle, as some of the conversation has been. And for us, that actually starts with the people in the outdoor sports community. That's the work that we're doing. There are about 50 million people who identify as either skiers, snowboarders, mountain bikers, trail runners, etc., in the United States. And so if only a fraction of those people actually voted with climate and environment as a priority, and there's a very significant overlap with the care that we have for public lands and climate to be able to mobilize this group. So if only a fraction of those people voted in places like North Carolina, in places like Michigan, in places like Nevada, in places like Arizona, then we could actually secure the path forward. And so our work is really to utilize the leverage that we have with our brand partners, with our athletes who have a total following on social media of close to 150 million people, to elevate the conversation within the outdoor sports community about the importance of climate change and engaging in the civic process. So we show up to DC, we showed up to DC for 10 years in a row. We show up usually with a big brand or big businesses that are located in the states that whose representatives we're lobbying, such whether it be Utah or Colorado or Wyoming or Montana. And then we show up with the athletes, and the athletes tell a very compelling story about what they're seeing in the mountains, and also the challenges that they're experiencing, particularly the Olympic athletes, the challenges that they're seeing in representing their country when they can't actually train. We mobilize people around elections. So this past election cycle, we reached about 38 million Americans within the outdoor sports community with a message of making a plan to vote and getting out to the polls. We partnered with Strava. So we do a lot of partnerships with the outdoor industry. So we partnered with Strava to run a challenge where 48,000 people either ran or biked to the polls in this election cycle. And then in off years, we do a lot of work around bills that we believe have significant importance on public lands and climate intersections, such as the protection for the Arctic National Wildlife Refuge, or the CORE Act that's to protect 467,000 acres here in Colorado. Ultimately, moving forward, what we see is an incredible opportunity and the imperative of working with the rhetoric and working to bring people into this movement through their passions, through things that the places, and to protect the places that they love, to protect the activities and the lifestyles that they practice and that they love. And we feel like that's a broader door for entry to people in the community, those 50 million Americans who may not necessarily resonate right off the bat with, we need to overthrow the government and put on a carbon tax. So that we can actually grow that tent, particularly in places where there's been a lot of misinformation, and where misinformation has actually been pretty effective. And so we feel like in order to get those people in the door, we need to connect with them through their passions, through their lifestyle, and through the places that they want to protect for themselves and for generations to come.
Thank you so much. This is just so invigorating. 150 million. The whole Convergence, you should have heard the numbers that each organization, the Covenant of Catholic Covenant, and they have X million, and this group has this million, and there's just so much huge capacity out there. So this whole conversation and dream is, how are we going to move and act as one, and what's going to inspire us to all go to the mat? But I just am very excited about what you just said. So next up, we have Leslie Kagan. I first met Leslie organizing for the march on DC after the election. And I was a manic mess because I had just recently found out what an emergency situation this all was. I just found out all these numbers of 10 years, 1.5, and I was panicking. And I walked into this, most experienced organizer in the world, and the first thing I wanted to do was change the flyer. I don't know if you remember, Leslie. I'm sure you do. And I want to apologize publicly for that now. But I love you and admire and worship the work you do. And so you're one of the great masters. We've got everything we have now. What's missing? And how are we going to, like you did the Protect the Vote, you saw that coalition. How are we going to could we create a formal infrastructure that is permanently in place, that links all these direct action groups around the country, at least with a phone chain? I remember the phone chains, Leslie?
Yeah.
Calling it a climate tree, or something. So at least we're like, put the infrastructure in place so we're ready to roll, like this when we need it, or, as a general idea. But thank you for being here and welcome.
Well, thank you. Thanks, everyone. Of course, one of the challenges of following an introduction like that is that there's no way I'm going to be able to rise to all of that. But having said that, let me say a few comments, partially off of what others have already said. And first of all, of course, thank Todd and the whole crew that's put this together. I'm sorry I wasn't able to get on the earlier conversations, but and let me just anchor this in the moment that we're in. And two specific things that are not on the surface or immediately seen by many people as related to climate, although I think that it is deeply related to the issues that we're facing. One is the COVID crisis. It is, I don't have to tell you all, it is massive, it is getting worse, it is not getting better, and it is literally killing people and undermining whatever economic security many people had. The other is the out and out assault on even the flawed reality of democratic institutions in this country in this last year, and it's still going on. And I think this is important to raise both of these because they are real, they are in the moment, and because I think they have a direct relationship not only to the reality of the climate crisis, but also our ability to tackle the climate crisis. I want to raise a few concerns and questions for further thought and conversation here. One is that I completely agree that having national legislation and national policy changes that are actually implemented. It's one thing to pass legislation, it's another thing to implement it. Needs to be a top priority. Having said that, I don't believe that all the changes that we need to make only happen in that national legislative arena. They need to be happening at the local level, at the statewide level, and on the other end of things, on the international, on the global level. So we need to place this project, which is an important one, of focusing on national climate legislation in that context. And we need a system or a structure or a set of structures for those various levels of activity and hopefully policy changes to be intersecting with each other so that we're pulling the best out of the local work, the statewide work, the regional work, the national and the international work to make the whole. As we all know, the climate crisis doesn't rest in one neighborhood or in one region of one country. It is a global nightmare that we all face. I also think that that may not be realistic at this moment anyway, to think about a strategy that focuses primarily on one bill, trying to pull it all together. We need to attack this global crisis in many different ways. And I think being open to a variety of pieces of legislation is not the same thing as being incremental. Right? There are a variety of different reasons why bills might need to be separated out from each other, again, striving to integrate them in the end. I also want to say that we need to be even more open than we are already to real policy solutions coming from the bottom up, coming from the neighborhoods, the communities, the constituent groups that are most impacted here. And that means challenging ourselves and each other in the most supportive and loving way possible to acknowledge some real historic and ongoing divisions, certainly in this country. I can't speak about this for all countries in the world, but in this country, specifically, I'm talking about race and class and gender, and how those structures, those historic, deeply rooted structures, make it harder for us to work together. They even make it harder for many white people to hear what people of color are saying, let alone work together and take leadership from people who don't necessarily look like us. So that's an ongoing challenge that I think we can't ignore, put aside, wait to deal with later. It has to be integrated in. And then The other challenge that I would lay in front of us all is the challenge of constantly finding ways, looking for ways to help people see how the climate crisis is directly related to the other issues that they are working on. I think it is true, it's clearly true that many, many more people understand there is a climate crisis. What they haven't necessarily all jumped to yet is understanding how, if I'm working on housing, right, how is that related to climate? Or if I'm working on voting rights, how is that related to climate? We as climate activists and organizers need to help people understand and see how what their primary concerns might be are not foreign to or separated out from the climate crisis. In other words, we need a movement that is grounded in a very holistic approach, and an approach that demands systemic changes that have led to this climate crisis, systemic problems that have led to this climate crisis and therefore changes. So what I'm trying to suggest here is that we need to actively pursue a strategy that incorporates many constituencies, many tactics, many points of entry for people, and understands the complexity at the same time. It is a massive undertaking, but the climate crisis itself is massive. So to rise to that reality of trying to slow down, to stop the climate crisis from getting worse, means that our thinking about how we're organizing, how we're focusing our energies, how we're working together needs to be complex and rich. And to think that there's one path to doing all this work, I think is not realistic. And I don't think it's necessary either. I think many paths that are, and many approaches that are in touch with each other, that are coordinating with each other, that are cooperating with each other, is going to give us a lot more mobility and therefore we could be a stronger movement, as opposed to encouraging everybody to take one path. So that's all I want to say is kind of opening comments here. Hope that's helpful.
Thank you so much, Leslie. All right, so that's wonderful. And I think maybe we'll go, I'll ask Leslie a follow-up question and we'll go in reverse order back. Leslie, the New York Renews model, which I believe you were quite involved in orchestrating, you started with a bill. And that bill led hundreds of people to go all the way to Albany multiple times. I was arrested 3 times for that bill without even loving the bill, frankly. And I didn't care really because it was a tool. Yep. And it was a tool to force action by the legislature. So, I mean, we have multiple bills in the Climate Digest. There are 10 in a package that we've packaged. Plastics, fracking, several farm bills. There are new bills coming out that would ban banks from funding fossil fuels and ban new fossil fuel infrastructure in another bill. There's another bill that would ban products from international forests, illegally deforested lands being imported. There are so many bills. And in my experience from the gay rights movement, for many years, we had the employment non-discrimination bill and then the housing non-discrimination bill and, all the pieces. And I worked for 6 years to get them to merge that into the Equality Act. And, in all of our decades, we hadn't passed a single federal civil rights bill. That bill was filed in 2015, and in 2019, it passed the House. So consolidating and coming up with something that's catchy and passionate that people are willing to put their lives on the line. This is the same model. It could be a package of bills. Things can move independently. But how do we crystallize that demand like you did with New York Renews that mobilize those forces to actually make something happen in the legislature?
Right. Let me answer that quickly because it's obviously a long, we could spend days going over the details of all that. But let me just start by saying New York Renews is a New York statewide coalition focusing on the climate crisis. And the goal here is to move New York State off of fossil fuels and into 100% renewable energy economy. It's a major shift of the whole economy. If you're upending the energy economy, you're upending the whole economy, right? So it's a major, our goal is a comprehensive, very deep transformation of the energy economy and therefore the economy of New York State, which is like a major economy. But it didn't start with a bill. It started with a process of about a year and a half, almost 2 years, of direct conversations with groups and activists around the state to get buy-in, to get participation, to get agreement, to get to work out what kind of bill do we want and what are the principles guiding us, where's our unity. So it wasn't like somebody came to all these groups around the state and said, here's the bill, you want to work with us on it. It grew out of that process, and it took a while to develop that bill. That initial bill took about 3 years of work in the state legislature to pass. It's called the Climate Leadership and Community Protection Act. It changed over time. Once the coalition drafted a bill, it had to be turned over to people in the state Senate, in the state assembly, because they're the people who introduce it and vote on it, et cetera. They made changes. And in the end, as it was getting more and more clear that this bill was going to pass, then the governor stepped in and he made changes. So in the end, we actually were not totally happy with the bill either. there were important elements that we wanted in the bill around equity in particular, and meeting the needs of communities of color and the frontline communities, frontline in terms of the climate crisis, that were taken out or gutted down. Elements that we had put in the bill to protect the rights of workers, that there would be job transitions that need to happen. How do you protect the workers and their families and their communities in that process? Some of that was watered down. But as you said, Todd, and I totally agree with this, it was a step. And it opened up the door for more work, more energy, more demands. And we are now working on the companion bill, the Climate and Community Investment Act. And that is to generate the funds, the massive amount of money needed to actually make these transitions that need to be made. And that's in process now, and we will hopefully be introducing it in the next legislative session. I just want to also point out, though, that while that whole work, that process was going on, parallel campaigns and demands were unfolding in New York City, New York State. So, for instance, just yesterday, the controller of New York State announced that finally, after 8 years of a campaign, the divestment of New York State pension funds, not all of them, there's one pension fund this doesn't apply to, but will be divested on a fairly good timeline, not fast, not quite fast enough, but it's not the worst timeline. They'll be divesting from fossil fuels. This is a major step, an important step that had nothing to do, although actually the threat of legislative action to push the controller, to actually make it the law that the controller would have to move toward divestment, the threat of that, I think, was a pressure on the controller. But it was the grassroots organizing. The other thing I've just mentioned is the ongoing, and again, it's not only in New York, it's all around the country, the ongoing work to stop fossil fuel infrastructure. Yeah, that very little of that moves through a legislative process. That's a direct confrontation with the companies and with regulatory agencies, of course. But there was no legislation that was passed that stopped just a month or so ago, I forget exactly when, the action of trying to build an extension of a pipeline in North Brooklyn. So the other forms of action and pressure on policy are very, very important.
Wonderful. And I might say Stringer, the comptroller's desire to run for mayor might have helped a little bit too at the last moment, moving him forward. But it sounds like we're agreeing that a bill is a very powerful organizing tool, and it helps to focus all the energy and force action in a legislative body. whatever journey that takes. And so I'm still looking for that federal bill that serves that purpose. We had the Off Fossil Fuels Act, which actually had a moratorium on all new fossil fuel infrastructure. And it would, so you can block new infrastructure with a bill categorically. And just the last point, I will add that a process for drafting that bill is very important in what you said. And that's where you build the coalition that's going to go in to fight it. And you include everyone in the outset. And that's the team that was then invested in that product and willing to fight for it. So, all right, well, you and I could talk all day together. And one day I would love to just have a few hours just to pick your brain on everything that I'm trying to pull together and how to do it, more importantly. All right, so let's move around. Sorry, everybody. Let's see, we're going backwards. So Roy, welcome back. And any thoughts? We're going to try to get a little bit more on a 2-minute thing with the timers. You might hear it. And then that'll keep us going around a little faster.
Sure. Yeah, I mean, I was listening to some of what Leslie was saying, and I was struck by some of the comments about the divesting from fossil fuels and how that was a result of an 8-year campaign, right? And it's now on a timeline that you said is fairly good, but not as good as you would like it to be. And I'm just, I guess for me, one of the things I grapple with is the timeline that we do face, right? How can these gradual or incremental responses be commensurate or acceptable in the face of how the little amount of time that we have left? And I just want to highlight, I guess, why this is on my mind is there was a new report by the UN Environmental Program that just came out. I saw some reporting on it yesterday, and there were 2 key takeaways from that report that just blew my mind a little bit. One of them is that this year, as a result primarily of the COVID crisis, the carbon emissions are projected to be down by 7%. But this this results in only a 0.01 degree Celsius decrease in rising temperatures by 2050. Okay, so think of all the activity that we've stopped this year and what little impact it's going to have. And then I think also about another takeaway from the report, which is that they said that the top 1% of emitters, the global elite, produce more than double the emissions of the bottom 50%. Okay, so we take these things together and we're thinking about policies and strategies, et cetera. I'm not sure that there's an emergency brake strong enough for us to pull legislatively in the time period that we have in which to do it, if we have any time at all. So that's really the only thought that I have at this moment is in response to what Leslie was saying. I mean, I want to remain optimistic, but absent some extraordinary quasi-revolutionary movement in short order, I don't see appropriate legislation or policies being enacted to address those issues.
And Roy, okay, good. All right, let's come back to this. Very bold legislation could be drafted that would force a radical restructure of these kinds of things. So don't give up hope quite yet. But we do need that bill so we can fight for it. So, but when we come, I forget who's going to be next. But when we come back to Extinction Rebellion, I'd be interested in hearing more about your national network and how you're planning and thinking about collective mass mobilizations and actions over the next, short term, or when we get back into the streets, and then how you could see that connecting to other direct action groups, and how you're networking in those around the country on this front. So next up, we'll invite Mario. I'm sorry, taking everybody out of turn now. I'm a little messed up here but Mario, 2 minutes on these thoughts and how if there were something called an Earth Bill, for example. I like this term Earth Bill. And I've decided Earth stands for everyone, all, right, together, heave. But if there were such a demand that had crystallized from the movement writ large that we developed in community and had your input into it, would you think that your membership would that be an inspiration and a call to action for them?
Maybe, Todd. I think for some of them it would, just like for the general American population. For some of them it really would, and for some of them might not. And I think that this kind of bridges the conversation between Rory and Leslie as well. In my opinion, we tend to jump to the solution that we want without understanding that we need the people behind it. It happened to us in 2010 with tax, cap and trade bill, and we just, to me, what the piece that we're missing out of this conversation is we haven't really talked about what it's going to take to build a culture and to actually change a culture that is much broader than simply the climate movement, that will actually then support a piece of legislation that people rally around because they understand it, because they're bought into it. And if I think back in through American history, so many of the movements that have been successful, or the moments where movements have been successful, is they're actually built on values and passion. Before they gather around or rally around the bill. It's the right to love, it's the right to serve, it's we are all created equal. So there are these quintessential American passions and values that I think we often skip the step of mobilizing people based on those passions and the things that they love and want to protect, and jump straight into, we're going to have a piece of legislation that's probably, simply because of how the complex the issue is, going to be way too complicated for the majority of people who haven't been tracking the climate crisis for the last 10 or 20 years. And when we're talking about wanting to mobilize hundreds of thousands of new members, hundreds of thousands of new people into this movement, we're going to have to do that. We're going to have to take I think we're going to have to take a step back and actually bring them in with a broader tent and a call to action that talks to their passion, that talks to their loves, that talks to the things that they want to protect, before we get into, oh, we need a carbon price of X many dollars that amortizes over time to this end goal, because at that point I lost them with a carbon tax. So again, to me, it's how do we go into the places that we have neglected, that's, then a lot of places that we have neglected to even talk to. How do we talk to the legislators and the senators that we've talked to on the way that Teddy Roosevelt did, the way that the way that John Muir did with Teddy Roosevelt, and it's a way that really touches them in a personal way, and then also let them know that we're going to provide the backup, the cultural backup in their district, the cultural backup in their states, with these different constituencies, whether it be the faith constituency, the outdoors constituency, et cetera, to make moves based on values. I think that is a first step before we can say, if there's this one piece of legislation, we'll get everyone rallied around it.
Mm-hmm. Very interesting. There's always a chicken and egg question with respect to cultural change and legislative change. Will and Grace changed the culture for gay rights, and that sort of maybe created the opportunity for marriage equality to pass, but it only passed by one vote. And we only had it in 13 states before that. We still have 30 states with no civil rights protections, and people would be shocked that the culture has radically changed in support of gay people, and yet we still don't have legislative civil rights. So these are chicken and egg, and what drives what, and then sometimes the culture changes and we don't change the law. And I would say if we want to keep the snow caps snowing, there's some legislation that could, stop fossil fuels, and maybe we could sell that.
I'm a huge advocate for legislation. I have spent 10 years of my life working for legislation, both domestically and overseas, and policy. So I'm not undermining the importance of legislation and regulatory action by any means, but I think that we tend to just skip this step. We tend to just jump and focus solely on legislation and rallying around legislation or regulation or policy, and actually miss the cultural component. And I think, honestly, we've been getting our asses handed to us for several years because we've missed that step. I don't think it's one or the other. I think we absolutely have. There's no way we solve this without legislation. There's no way we solve this without international diplomacy and the framework like Paris. I completely agree. I just think sometimes we miss that step of bringing the people along with us in a way that they can actually get excited about.
Mm-hmm. I hear you. So it's about how you enter the conversation and what stream you're in, and that we're meeting people where they're at, and et cetera. I understand and appreciate that. All right. I think Lori Cotter, you're next, and then Jonathan, and then Christina. And I guess a little pointed question for you. Rise and Resist is an incredible model, but it's New York based. Do you know if there are other Rise and Resist? How do we populate the world with little Rise and Resists around the United States. Is it possible to replicate this model? And are you connected internationally? And maybe bring in the conversation about the Protect the Vote effort and how everyone was tied into that and how that worked with local autonomy decision-making and then the national level coordination and what little thorny issues might have appeared that could help us understand how to, improve and formalize this going forward.
There is not, to my knowledge, in other chapters of Rise and Resist. I think there are people that have used our model to some extent, but I don't think there's anybody, we don't have a coordinated network of Rise and Resist. And I just want to go back and speak a little to what Rory said and what Mario said, because I share Rory's frustration at, while I think legislation, we have to push for it, we have to keep pushing for it, time is running out. And that goes to the mobilization issue. How do we mobilize people? And everything everybody says is very important, bringing everybody in, working from the ground up. Yet I don't see this country mobilizing behind anything in a mass way. We apparently do not do that in the way that other countries do. And it is an ongoing frustration for me. While I can see that within New York City, we can get groups together, we can mobilize and do something, I am at a loss to see how it's going to work nationally, because we had a fascist in the White House for 4 years and most people just sat home and, and complained from the couch. And we're clearly in a climate crisis that it's going to kill us all. But I don't understand or see, and I wish I had an answer. I wish I could say, oh, well, if we just bring all these groups in, we'll mobilize and we'll have such a massive movement that change will happen faster. But I'm sadly very pessimistic, and I don't know how we're going to mobilize big enough, fast enough. And I don't think I answered your question, but I had to get that off my chest.
No, we're all in this panic. That's why, I was done after the gay rights stuff and immigration battles that I was in. And then I saw the numbers and I panicked again. And I'm like, okay, we have to do this again. We have to fight this fight together. And it's the greatest organizing challenge ever to face humanity. And there's no doubt about it. And that's why I keep coming back to a piece of federal legislation. When the healthcare bill fight happened and people mobilized everywhere, it was because there was a bill on the table to fight for. The immigration reform, comprehensive immigration reform, we mobilized all over the country because there was a bill to fight for. New York Renews, because there was a bill to fight for. Bills are the tool, I think, to incite that level of passion, because it puts the shiny, bright object in front of everybody. And they know, it's very simple.
I hope so.
Demand, no, it's not simple to get there, but the demand is what, and then once you have that demand, you can keep fighting for it over and over and over, like we did with the New York News bill. We kept going back and back and back and back. If it's just, if there's no demand that we're fighting to actually accomplish, then there's nothing to build toward. You can't build momentum and keep piling on the groups and expanding the network and unleashing everybody's unique creative energies, but with a common goal. So that's why I'm lobbying heavily for this. It's not an abstract concept for me. To me, it's an essential organizing tool without which we are floundering and there is no center of focus and force. But the urgency is what's got us all panicked, and that's I feel you. Jonathan.
Yeah, I'm gonna kind of piggyback on your question to Cotter, your focus with Cotter, because we're the same group, and I want to say that there are people that have contacted us and said, can we have a chapter? And we don't do that. We're all volunteers. We don't have any time. And at this point, after what we've been through in 4 years, our bandwidth is real short. But we do have a website and we have toolkits. Almost every working group has a toolkit, and that would be a tool that could be utilized nationally. So it's images, graphics. So when we did the Chase thing with you, Todd, and with other groups, New York Renews, We made little films, interstitial films to hit social media, signage, banners, slogans, and all of that stuff is available for people to take and use. It just takes the initiative. It takes people, how to get people to go, as Lori was saying, we've gone 4 years with people sitting on their couches. And we want to, get a bill across. And I want to address that is you'll never get a bill through, as you and Leslie were pointing out, that isn't watered down, that doesn't take forever to implement. And here I am listening to John Kerry on the radio this morning. And what's he talking about? He's talking about free market solutions. He's talking to oil companies. He's talking to banks. We don't have time. When we instituted, our working group really lifted off from what XR did in London, in England. And our timeline was 2025. That's what we said. And we can't help but stick to zero emissions, zero carbon, 2025. That's our goal. And sometimes I think, do we have the time to do the work that it takes to put a national federal bill together, given what we've had to do just with Albany? That's just a question. I also want to address what Leslie said about just one group. We talked about this last week in our working group, that also coming from many directions can be just as powerful as coming from one. We also have to bring people from the bottom, bring people from Elmhurst, talk to them. Housing, the epicenter of the COVID crisis for us in Elmhurst, BLM. This is a wonderful group of people I'm looking at. I'm concerned always about diversity, and looking at the faces here and in some of the other groups that I saw, I'm concerned about opening up the conversation to all kinds of people and bringing them in. And how to fire them up, that's the big question. We have been talking about in our working group recently, going after advertisers. We live in New York City. We work in New York City as Rise and Resist. And we've been thinking about targeting all the ad agencies. We were going to do an action at Bank of America because they were the one major bank that didn't say that they would not fund Arctic drilling. And we started scouting, and we put together a banner, we put together an action, we put together signage, and within a week of us starting that, we say we did direct action by osmosis because they pulled out. And they said, and that came from pressure, outside pressure. So we're talking a lot about outside, inside. We refer to ourselves as outside. Mm-hmm. And a lot of the outside people, it's really making it happen. The pressure on Bank of America that came from all kinds of directions made them cough it up. Of course, the bill is the way to go. Of course, we've got to try and get that through. But in my view, we got to get it through in a week. We got to get it through in a month. That's the question.
I love it. All right. So a few things. Just to sketch it out, I think we could it would take probably a year to the kind of bill and alignment, although there are 10 to 15 bills that are ready to go now that could be packaged and used as an immediate tool, and they will make substantial down payments on this, depending on, there are bills to ban all fracking, no new infrastructure. I should mention that MIT and Project Drawdown were on our panels earlier, and they have agreed to create the Scientific Advisory Committee to assess the greenhouse gas reduction impacts of various proposed legislation. So they will give us a number. If you pass this bill, it will reduce greenhouse gases by X amount, we believe, and then a system for monitoring that after passage for implementation to make sure that we don't wait 15 years on a hope and a prayer and then find out it didn't work. So we find out along the way. So there is that possibility. So a year to draft a bill and a year to build out more formal national coalition infrastructure, and then a year to fight to take the Senate. And I think by the third year, we would be in a position as a movement to force major legislation to happen. And so that's not a long period of time when we're looking at now when the most aggressive bills have 98 votes and most of the bills have about 23 votes, even the fracking bans, of a handful of sponsors. So the idea of passing comprehensive climate legislation in 3 years from where we're sitting now would be lightning speed. But it will require all of us doubling down over the next year to focus on crafting that. But so, all right.
Todd, I want to throw a question back at you. Just very quickly. We're supposedly, if we can get out of this, going to have a climate czar. How does that change how things filter through, the mechanics of government? How much is he and how much is that entity going to change? How information, how needs and wants and desires, how is, this is a new concept for me to have this, everybody was like, oh great, we're going to have a climate czar. And I was sort of like, it's John Kerry and it's Chase Bank and it's Exxon Mobil. And the lobbyists are just going to be all over this. How do you see the office of a climate czar changing how a bill would go through?
My approach to legislation and movement building is to ignore administrations and ignore the legislative bodies entirely. I think civil society needs to decide what is scientifically required, get all the big greens and all of us aligned on that, which is no small feat, but there was definite openness to that on panel 2, which will all be out on video soon. Everyone can go back and look at them. And so I don't think we have to, I never think about the inside because we're building an outside pressure that's going to change the inside politics. And everything you do on that front will just be pressure on those insiders. I'm from the gay rights movement. No one's ever helped us. We fought for everything. So neither party has ever been our friend. And I just don't, believe in the insider route. It's going to save us. I was the ombudsman for the governor on brownfields revitalization a long time ago. And I served a very important function, but it was already because we had passed legislation and I was implementing it. So that's very different. So he's just working in the same body politic that exists today. I think the impacts will be better on the international stage, which is why they've, appointed somebody like him. And so I think that's critical. And he'll probably do most of his work internationally. The DC and Climate Council was also on our opening meeting, and they're working more the internal politics of it. And so there's movement happening in every direction. I think that's great. But I say don't count on government or elected officials to save us. I believe we have to save ourselves. All right, so turning back to the organizational challenges, and we keep moving around, and we can also expand the topic, but I want to get a little bit more into the nitty gritty. We need a direct action group in every congressional district, in my opinion. We need to build out the direct action infrastructure. So Extinction Rebellion, and you're next. I know you have lots of groups sprouted up all over the place. And that's one model. I think the Rise and Resist model of the internal organizing model is, something that needs to be, is a great model. So I'm not saying it's our job to create those, although it sort of is if we need them and no one else is doing it, right? I mean, I created all of this out of thin air because I felt it was what we needed. So I think you could. If everyone said, I'm going to adopt a district instead of, we're going to find a friend in another city that we're from, and we're going to ask them to start a Rise and Resist group. And then we'll have a periodic meeting once a month where we just invite people from around the country to teach them how to start their own groups. I'm just throwing ideas out there off the top of my head, literally, because I had not contemplated saying this, but we need a direct action group in every congressional district, in my opinion. And there are already climate groups that could do this, et cetera. So I'm just brainstorming. Christine, so how do you see the XR model or your existing network? And what's the planning these days in terms of nationwide mobilization? And then we'll get around to Leslie again, like she's always doing the next big march, right? So how do we coordinate that among all the direct action groups and make sure Mario's group is there? And it's not just marching in the street, but maybe marching to the congressman's office or the congresswoman's office. So we target that external pressure directly on the decision makers. There are 435 of them that can change the fate of humanity. And so they are the targets. That's not complicated, targets. And then we gotta get the demand, but then now what is the organizing plan on the district to force them to action? So that's, Christine, you're up. And on those thoughts or any others that you want to share, of course.
Sure. I mean, I think just looking at how big this country is, right? We are so culturally diverse. We all have very different political views, and they could be a mesh of, what we see as the mainstream. And so this isn't the UK, this isn't France, right? Where they're able to fairly quickly mobilize. And they also have a long history of that within their country. It's a very different kind of societal understanding of taking care of each other, and, the collective good is, tends to be a higher priority. But as we've seen in this country with COVID, I think we can all say that COVID has been a case study for climate and ecological crisis in many ways. People are dying around us, and we have the tools to mitigate it through behavior change, right? Same thing for the climate crisis. But we're not, because it's, I don't want to wear a mask, or I don't want to change my behavior. And so when you get into big, large scale organizing, it comes down to having simple messaging, right? There's a reason why XR's demands are simple. Act now, tell the truth, and get a citizens assembly. And in the US, we have a whole demand around climate justice. But the issues that we're facing are, once you get into the details, Todd, as you mentioned before, talking about policy, you go down a rabbit hole, and then people get divisive over these things. So if you really want to mobilize people at that level, it's simple messaging for a specific goal. And why we continue to say citizens assemblies, it brings in this culture shift that everyone's been talking about, that we're not going to be able to make these massive changes that I think we're all on the same page that we need to do, without having the desire behind it. And that's a big part of what citizens assembly can do. France implemented ecocide. So it's now illegal to kill the environment and ecosystems. They've completely changed how they do things within the cities. They've banned heating lamps at their restaurants because of the carbon footprint. And guess what? New York is adding them at this point so that we can do outdoor dining. I think we also really need to look at the fact that the activist space is not welcoming to everyone, right? There are people who care about the climate crisis who maybe it's not their cup of tea. I've talked to plenty of people who work within banks and corporations who care about this with the same level that we all do. And so there's a whole aspect of grassroots organizing within corporations and banks and all of these other things, which can help push the envelope as well. I think we're also up against a lot more in this country. Money and corporations and our free market economy is focusing on economic growth, purposely doesn't look at the effects it has, because it is looking at the short-term bottom line. So I think we also need to realize that if we're organizing in New York City, we have different priorities and a different population here than, say, farmers in Nebraska. And so you get into the nitty-gritty of, well, what does climate justice mean to a farmer or someone who works within the fracking industry? It brings in all of these levels, and we have to collectively want to be on the same page or to really even acknowledge it. And that's XR's model of how we grew so quickly was the Heading for Extinction talk, which basically brings you through understanding what is happening in the world and then tells you what you can do about it. And that's really like the cornerstone of how we were able to organize so big so quickly.
And Christine, thank you for all of that. And so how many chapters of XR are there in the United States? Did you say that earlier?
There, before COVID, there was about 70. At this point, the Northeast region is really organizing together. So there's a whole kind of subset that has grown out of that. That's made up of all the chapters, and the chapters feed into the region. And so that's really, we're now working together. I think throughout the rest of the country, it's just been with COVID, especially the numbers have gone down, and Black Lives Matter protests have, really shifted people's focus for this time being. But to really get to that model of how do you, there's also the thought of, well, we could do direct action in every state capital at the same time with the same message, right? Because then at least you're breaking it down. And guess what? Some of our states are the size of countries in Europe, so it's like we just really need to remember the scale of what we're trying to accomplish. And it seems like we're beating our head against a wall most of the time. But it's also just like we're undertaking something that, no other country in the world is really kind of dealing with like we are. And we're living in a bubble, we're talking about international relationships and everything. Europe and other places in the global South are so far ahead already of tackling these issues. And the US is like, purposely, it's almost like we're not getting that information, so that we don't know that those changes are happening.
Mm-hmm. All right. So, but the network is there. There are local chapters. I'm just trying to get us to barrel down a little bit into the mechanics as we continue for the next few minutes, half hour. The mechanics of what we have. So it's like doing an assessment of the, and then what we could maybe create or co-create. And then how the environmental chapters and various could link up with not environmental chapters, but XR chapters could possibly link up if there were many coalitions in each congressional district. So we have this adopted district program, and it's the local 350 chapter or climate reality chapter or Unitarian Universalist. And they're organized around these package of bills, and already 60 districts in 20 states. But they're not necessarily all going to be inclined towards direct action. And that's fine. There's room for all different kinds of tactics. So, but if we could overlay a direct action, map, like one of those little cellophane things, you put it down and they appear on top of this, that would, I think, be a fascinating capacity enhancer. And that would be an interesting logistical goal to set for the year. As we're still, dealing with not being able to leave the house, we can still organize our capacity and infrastructure. So anyway, I'm just tossing it out there to keep us, to try to focus our minds on the infrastructure conversation and how we can create that capacity locally. All right, we're coming back now. I think, Leslie, you're up.
Okay, great. I just want to make a few quick things. One point is I want to make a quick note here that I know there's a difference between building an organization and building a movement. So organizations, I think, are critically important to advancing any kind of real social change process. I also happen to think that movement building is important. And by that, I mean that not every activity, not every issue or formulation on an issue, and not every person is going to be in the same entity, in the same structure. And I don't think we need to think, I think that's a good thing. Certainly at this point in this country, I think encouraging a full array of ways that people can be involved, whether that's direct action in the ways that it's often talked about, that is nonviolent civil disobedience, an immediate and obvious and direct confrontation in the best sense of that word with power, and trying to stop power from actually moving forward, trying to interfere with the function of whatever the issue might be, the functioning power that an entity has. I think there are other ways at the same time that we should be encouraging people to take action, whether you want to call it direct action or not. But so for some people, going to visit, and whether it's a virtual visit in the time of COVID or at some point again in life, real time visit in the office of an elected official, that's the extent, that is what they can do. That is what they feel comfortable doing. We should encourage them to do that. Right? It may be that all somebody can do is write a letter to the editor, right? And we should encourage that. Or it may be that some people want to do a whole bunch of things. So I think our job is to encourage as many different avenues for people to, or paths for people to walk on, right? And then again, part of the challenge is coordinating that so we maximize the impact. The other thing I just want to say quickly is that in terms of who our targets are, and it is true that there are 435 members of Congress, as you said, Todd, who are decision makers, but they are not the only decision makers in this country, or I dare say in probably most countries of the world. The elected leadership is not the only center of power. So for instance, again, going back to the divestment movement, which is, I think, an important piece of the climate movement, that's directed not at legislation and legislators, but it's directly, trying to have a direct impact on how, what happens to the pension funds, which are billions and billions of dollars, when you add it all up, invested in fossil fuel companies, taking away that piece of the power that some fossil fuel companies have, that many of them have, that economic power, is an important contribution. So again, I think that's another tactic. It's another venue for people and organizations to get engaged in it. And I think if our mindset is about building a movement, we can be much more nimble. We allow for a lot more flexibility in terms of actions and targets and even messaging. The clear message is that there is a climate crisis, a global climate crisis that demands immediate, bold, creative, deep, whatever words you want to use, action to stop the further degradation of the planet, right? To try and put a halt to the climate crisis getting a lot worse than it already is. And that is just going to require people approaching it and being encouraged to approach it from different angles, including different tactics and different targets. Again, for me, the ideal is to be encouraging all that and at the same time looking for coordination and cooperation. So if a bill is being introduced at a state level or in Congress, wherever it is, that people understand that's in process. What can your organization, what can your group, whether you're a national organization or a local group, whatever, do that maybe helps move that process along? Not to the exclusion of other activities and other focal points that you might have, but rather to help be supportive for these different parts of our movement to support one another and amplify the work of each other so that together we're having a greater impact. So again, just to be very clear, I'm not saying that a national package of bills is unimportant. I happen to believe it could be very important. And as you said, Todd, one way it can be important is if it's a good package, it could inspire people and motivate people. But if we only or primarily focus on that, I think we're missing opportunities both to bring more people in, more organizations in, and at the same time, we're missing opportunities to actually change the reality on the ground.
Mm-hmm. Wonderful. Thank you so much, Leslie. Yes, and I hope nothing I've said suggests that these are mutually exclusive or even in the alternative. I'm a both and type of person. both and, 6 of them, I think. And so, and I feel like we have this multiplicity of initiatives and efforts, 1,000 points of light trying to pull at the, fabric of the opposition or the power structures. And I'm just looking at the outcomes and I don't see any results at the macro scale that we need. So I'm still trying to figure out how do we thread all those millions of efforts, and they can still have all their different approaches and tactics, of course, but share in a common demand. So at the end of every letter, pass the Earth Bill. At the end of every march, pass the Earth Bill, protest. And they said 40 other different things, and at least it was included. So I want to switch a little bit to protect the vote, because that was an inspiration, frankly. I didn't get into all those calls until the end because I knew y'all had it in hand, and hallelujah, and I was sort of doing a lot of other things. So that's a fascinating framework. And I know, Leslie, you were in the middle of it. I think Rise and Resist was in the middle of it. Let's talk just a little bit about that, because is that a coalition that, or a model, or I know it was ad hoc again, all thrown up together. Who knows who's leading it now? All these things when we come together and we disappear. So how do we institutionalize, not in like the heavy sense, but how do we keep these frameworks alive and functioning and working on the next big thing as opposed to just whenever the fever hits? Go ahead, Leslie, since we're picking up with you, and we'll go back again.
Okay, sure. Yeah, I was mostly involved in the New York City Protect the Results coalition that came together, and somewhat in a less intense way involved on the national stuff. I don't think it's actually an ideal model, certainly at the national level, for a variety of reasons. And I think it was unique to a moment where an election was coming that we knew that the current resident of the White House and his team, his gang, I don't know what else to call them, we're going to try to undermine, and the very real possibilities of some form of a coup could have, unfolded. I actually don't think we're quite out of the waters yet. I think Biden will become, the president on at noon on January 20th. But between now and then, there's still time for more damage to be done. Trump is, there's a lot of problems with Trump, and he is on a path that could make things even more complicated and more dangerous. And what he's unleashed in terms of his white supremacist, racist, gun-toting base. And I'm not saying everybody who voted for Trump falls into that, but the millions of people that do fall into that is a very dangerous on the ground reality. Just the news from Michigan yesterday, I think it was, about a state legislator being threatened and her family, and it's jumping up all around the country. So the Protect the Results thing came together, really in that kind of moment. And I think we're in a different dynamic here because the climate crisis has been going on for years, as you all know, but the climate movement has also been quite active for years now. There are organizations, there are community-based groups, there are national organizations, there are campaigns, there are projects, there's activity, actions, there's lobbying, there's all kinds of stuff that's been going on. So the landscape is different, I think, than the Protect the Results model was. And there are plenty of other examples in our own country's history of coalitions being built, coalitions, networks, alliances, whatever words you want to use, but people coming together, people and organizations coming together to work cooperatively. I think we have to look at all of those, but I think the foundation for me anyway is always a commitment to the grassroots, the community-based organizing at the local level. In fact, it was Tip O'Neill, who served as the Speaker of the House of Representatives for many, many, many years ago, who always said all politics is local. And I think all social change is local as well. It is stronger, it is more powerful and more effective, I think, when those local expressions of our movement are connected to each other. Because there are things that happen at the national, at the international level that impact our lives, and we need to impact those realities as well. Mm-hmm. So, but I think grounding our work and our movement in the local, in the communities, and on top of that, for climate change in particular, that there are so many innovative, smart, creative ideas that are coming out of local realities, not only in this country, but all around the world, that have to do both with climate resilience and also with stopping the further advancement of the climate crisis. So there are a lot of reasons to ground all this work at the local level.
Mm-hmm. All right, so wonderful. Thank you. I guess, People's Climate Movement and basically mass mobilization and all of y'all. So we're going to keep going through the list, but I just want to think about, what are the plans for next year? What are our plans? Are there plans? And so it's a network that was brought together for one thing, but is that network going to be, at least the members of that network, are they interested in climate? And how are we going to mobilize next year, and around what's going to get us excited to mobilize on climate next year, I guess?
Let me just quickly jump in. I think a lot of the groups, both here in New York City and at the national level, that were involved in the Protect the Results effort are interested in climate, and some are very actively engaged in it. I don't know that anybody, we don't really know yet what's happening with the COVID crisis. We don't really know how we're going to get out of the economic crisis of this country. I actually think dealing with the climate crisis honestly and boldly can help us get out of the economic crisis.
Yeah.
The transition of fossil fuels can be a very big job creating, undertaking. So, but I don't know that I haven't heard anybody lay out a plan for 2021.
Mm-hmm. Well, so maybe early in next year, maybe a convening of the Protect the Vote coalition, or, Leslie can send out an email just so everyone knows, and bring the whole world together for at least a conversation, and if not, a mass mobilization when the timing is right and the ideas are right, or the motivation is right. So maybe it's time for a little internal conversations around that whenever your breath, returns and you have the energy again, of course, early next year, to talk about that and see what we could sketch out a plan. There's Earth Day, of course, that always seems to mobilize people. There's COP25. And later in the year, there's some other big event in the middle. I forgot, somebody mentioned. So there's some, natural organizing moments of potential. And can we start to think about that and then start weaving ourselves together here with that vision, and then use that to build growing local capacity? So we have a march in 435 congressional districts, by next October. That would be a miracle. All right, let's keep everyone one more round, I think, guys and ladies. 7:44. Who says we can't fill out the time with interesting things? All right. I'm frankly confused about the order at this point, so we'll go backwards again. Mario?
Sure. There's a lot there to unpack, but something to add, I think, in talking about plans for 2021. I think that we need to do a lot of work with potential allies in the GOP who would be friendly towards climate legislation, who would be friendly towards climate action, who maybe were scared to do so under the Trump administration. But there's also a lot of education that's necessary. So when we went to DC last year in 2019, one of the takeaways that I came out of several meetings is that there's a lot of these members have 17, 20, 25 priorities and groups coming at them all the time. And we, I think, can do a better job at being more educational with them and actually walking them through where the science is at, where the technology is at, where the solutions are at, and the level of support that we can bring to them if they get behind climate action, rather than a lot of times, I think, many times we come with very strict demands and a very aggressive posture towards it. And I do believe that there are members of Congress, and there are lots of members and there are members in the Senate that we could actually work with to moving this forward. If we said, hey, here's the education, here is where, let's bring in the renewable energy companies. Let's bring in the job creators in their states. Let's bring in people who are interested in investing in their states and creating jobs in their states, whether it's from the ski industry, whether it's from the renewable energy industry, whatever other companies does, for whom it's also a priority. And let's educate those members on not only what the solutions are that we want them to implement in order to warm them up to the idea of a bill or of a series of bills, but then let's also say, hey, we will have your back, and these are the constituencies that we can actually mobilize to have your back. if you actually vote the right way on this. Because ultimately, it's a political calculus. If we're not coming with the billions of dollars that is Chevron or an X&R, and for them, it's a political calculus. All right, do they have the votes? Am I going to have the support? Is this going to cost me my job at the next election? And to me, that's the 1-2 approach that we need to take. It's fortunately, we now no longer have a tyrant who's willing to go after anyone in his own party for saying anything against other than what he has said, particularly even on climate. And I think that will open up opportunities for certain members of the Congress and to work with us. And then on the flip side of that, we need to actually deliver on mobilizing those constituencies. And to me, that's part of what I was speaking about earlier in terms of the cultural change. How can we make climate not be toxic for their constituencies, particularly in places like North Carolina, in Nevada, Arizona, so much of the West where most of our presence is, Wyoming. There's huge opportunities for job creation, huge opportunities for economic stability, and there's huge passion for the outdoors and the environment. But there's been this miseducation of both the people and the elected officials. And if we can work towards providing that ground cover as well as the education for the decision making once we have something like a set of bills or a bill that we want to get behind, I think that'll do us very well, much better than just showing up and saying these are our demands, and if you're not with us, you're one of the bad guys.
Well, thank you, Mario, for that. And it makes me think of Climate Reality Project. Oh, obviously, I forgot you have that background. Well, so Ken was on, and 30,000 trained organizers, and this is their philosophy approach. And Citizens Climate Lobby shares a similar ethos about how to gently approach and respectfully approach. And so I think the good thing with a common goal is that everybody can do it their own way. So, and sometimes the crazy people on the outside, of which I'm usually, but I can go back and forth. I can put on the suit and fool them for a little while, but I'm really the crazy one on the outside at heart. These create space and opportunities for each other. So they're not mutually exclusive tactics, and we're never going to get everyone to agree on tactics. We might be able to get people to agree on a demand or the focus of our ask. But that's what they call it. And when you're doing it nicely, it's called an ask. And otherwise it's called demand. So I think this multitude of approaches is also extremely valuable, and buttressing them up on their re-election campaign is music to their ears, of course. So lovely. I see this, I hear it. All right. So 5, 4. Roy, I think you're next.
Okay, great. Yeah, let me make just 2 quick general comments in response to some of the things that were said. First, I agree with many of the folks who've said that the diversity of tactics is important here, ranging from writing a letter to your senator to direct action to advocating for legislation, et cetera. My concern becomes organizationally in terms of allocating resources, scarce resources, but that's a different conversation. Then separately, Mario just spoke about the educational aspect of all this, and I completely agree. In fact, I conceive of Extinction Rebellion as sort of a civic education project, and in education we have this idea of differentiated instruction. For example, my cat has to be removed from the classroom, but yeah, so differentiated instruction, which is reaching people where they are, and especially in a way that does not repulse or repel them from your core messaging. And so when I'm speaking, about revolutionary overthrow of the government, I say that to all of you because it's a very select audience. I would not necessarily say that to my, friends and relatives in Appalachia where I grew up, at least not at the outset of the conversation. But to your question, Todd, about organizing into the future, I'm not actively involved with XR's efforts anymore. I'm outside of the city writing, but what I would love to see is a move away from sort of protesting or disruptive actions and towards disruptive actions that aren't aimed at some specific outcome, towards constructive actions. And especially what I would love to see is something like a general strike. I mean, right now, in India, the largest general strike in human history is occurring. It's completely blacked out by mainstream corporate media in the West. But this is something where XR and all these other organizations could come together in the form of a coalition. I mean, 19 million people right now are on the verge of being evicted when eviction protections expire at the end of December, for example. So there's a felt need right now for this type of movement. And if we could advocate for and galvanize around a specific event, I almost wish Trump had won re-election, because perhaps his inauguration could have been this galvanizing event. Obviously, I don't want him in power. But the problem is that, as I think, I'm sorry, I'm blanking on the names, Lori maybe mentioned earlier, you know, folks, even in the face of a fascist in the White House, were relatively inactive compared to what we would have liked to have seen. If we could all come together in that way and organize for a general strike that not only aims at certain policy outcomes, but also helps to educate and, importantly, crucially perhaps, provide mutual aid for folks that are struggling and desperate right now. Because all of these things, this concatenation of crises, are bearing down on the American public, the global public, in very dire ways that demand immediate attention. And I think something like a general strike is the mechanism by which we can unite and coalesce all of our sort of momentum and disparate forces into one single event, which then also demonstrates to power that, hey, we pose a real threat to you. Pass our goddamn climate legislation, or we're going to do this again and again and again. Something like that. That's what I would love to see. It won't happen, but we can dream.
Thank you. Thank you. All right. So we have about 8 more minutes, and we're going to the climate cabaret after this, right into it. And at some point I have to get up and go to the bathroom before that happens. So we have about 6 more minutes, and then we'll take a little bit of break, and I just hope everyone will stick with us. It's the same link. And if you, the performers are going to start popping in here a little bit before 8, maybe into the panel. There's a whole slew of them. So before that happens, so I just wanted to signal that, and then we'll have everyone else speak. So it's Cotter, Jonathan, and then Christina, and a minute or so each, if you could. And it sounds like it's time for a brainstorming session among everybody here, not today, but soon, about what next year could look like. But so please go ahead, Cotter.
Yeah, I think there is some brainstorming to be done. I like the idea of a general strike, and I could see it being organized. I like the idea of someone suggested once that the Green New Deal should have been Green New Jobs. And I think that would have sold it better for a lot of people, but I do think we're in an economic crisis. If we could wrap those together, that if we get off fossil fuels and we go toward clean energy, we have new jobs, lots and lots of jobs. And a way to get it may be a general strike. I'm just going to go ahead and brainstorm that a little bit, because I think that would wake people up. And I think if we had actual legislation around that, actual demands for the economy to shift, that something like a general strike could be effective in moving that forward.
Interesting. All right, juices are flowing. Jonathan.
Yeah, on the general strike note, it's something we've talked about a great deal in Rise and Resist. And the thing that keeps coming up is a general strike means general. Everybody's got to do it. And that's really, really hard to do in this country the way it is now. We've thrown it around, and we don't quite see it as viable as far as how Americans have been behaving, particularly of late. I'm going to get really negative, and then I'll get real positive. We talked a lot in our early meetings in the climate group that what we really needed was a War Powers Act. What is happening to this planet means we need a mass mobilization on a federal level, just like with World War I, the first War Powers Act, World War II. So for me, unfortunately, legislation and billing and all that is a few steps back. But trying to get this country to accept a full federal response, that's also another impossibility. To address protect the vote, it's the same thing with Stop the Money Pipeline. The national coalition really came a little bit in conflict with the local. And yes, it was an in the moment thing, but we really at a certain point went, no, we want to take to the streets here. And national was like, no. How do we fix that? That was an amazing collection and coalition, but we took to the street, we did it. But they kept saying, no, we don't know. We're going to hold back. We're going to hold back. And we kept saying, why are they holding back? And we really couldn't get a full answer to that. As far as 2021 and Rise and Resist is concerned, as far as opening chapters somewhere else, that's not anything we can do. And also, we talk a lot about in our group, not reinventing the wheel. So there are groups, even if it's one or two people in a living room, they're out there in congressional districts. And to collect those names, I mean, I remember early on, there's a Resist and Rise group somewhere, and it's like 3 people. They didn't even know we existed. So to get those groups together and reach out to them and offer tools to them and offer the information and not open chapters and organize that. Personally, we don't have the bandwidth or the power to do that. So I think that a great thing to do would be to reach out to the groups that are already there and get them motivated.
Fabulous. And build that phone tree at a minimum. So we're like, oh,
That's
at least
it. We'll get Leslie to write an email.
At least we have emails and phone numbers. Exactly. All right, real quick, Christine. Then we're going to close this out and invite the performers in. Closing thoughts.
First off, I just want to thank you, Todd, for putting this all together. I'm sure it's been a crazy 2 days. I think the biggest thing in this country and really anywhere is how do you use economic effect to make things happen? So, everyone's talking about a general strike. That's great. It also comes down to being strategic with how we're trying to do these things. And Jonathan talked about national versus local. We've had the similar things within New York City because we have a whole bunch of neighborhood groups. So, New York City has the kind of big messaging and big tactics. And then the neighborhood groups have taken on the North Brooklyn pipeline was something that neighborhood groups took on. There's now, a whole composting pushback against the city as COVID's, going down that realm. So I think that there's a lot of different models to deal with that. But I think at the end of the day, this country is hurting a lot from the economic implosion of COVID. And we need to figure out how we target that energy into these things and make it actually make sense and have an impact.
All right. Wonderful, wonderful. This is an incredible group. All of y'all are amazing. I have hope because of you. And thank you all for being here. We're going to continue these conversations. Mark down January 13th at noon. We're going to invite all the participant panelists from this Convergence over 2 days, over 40 amazing people. And we'll just have a little brainstorming session about next steps together, and everyone will be welcome to that. And thank you all. I'm going to close my video for 2 seconds. I don't know if anyone on our team could come on and, but if we could just be quiet, everyone will just, I guess we'll be quiet for a couple seconds and we'll come back and we're going to start the Climate Cabaret. And I'm going to open it up, I believe, with something. We'll see what Barbara says about that. Barbara Brussel and is going to be our host. And we're going to have a party now. We deserved it. We've earned it. And please, everyone, stick around and let's celebrate together. Thank you so much. Thank you all so much. Yes. Okay, I'll be right back. Is the tech team back there and y'all put up a folder?
I'm here. Matt is supposed to put up a slide. So I'm waiting for that.
Up goes the slide, and everyone else, we could move you to the audience, all the other panelists, and you can stay if you'd like. And I'll be right back.
Can you hear me yet?
Yes, Barbara, I just
Yes.
heard you.
Hey,
Okay.
honey. I'm watching you.
Hello.
It sounds so great. Thank you, everybody.
Oh,
Thank
this
you for
is
your time and your interest in doing what you're doing. We love you. Thank you.
This is Barbara Brussel, one of the first cabaret artists I met when I moved to New York, and I just fell in love with her genuine passion and the way it comes across performing.
I'd show my face, but I can't. My video, the host has stopped me. So I have to be allowed. So go do your, I'll get on if you want me to and hold space.
Yeah, hold
I'm on
space,
it. I'll enable
right back.
videos.
Okay.
Thank you. There goes Todd.
Yeah.
Christina and Leslie, are you going to stay?
I can only speak for myself, of course, but I need to go. But I just wanted to thank everybody. This has been a really interesting conversation. So
Oh, it's been great. Thank you for showing up.
sure.
Thank you.
To everyone.
Bye. Christina, are you going to stay?
I
Hey,
might
there's
stay
our
for a few
videos.
minutes. Yeah.
Okay.
I see Karen Oberlin. I see Mark Miller. Hi, everybody. Oh, and there's John Mark. You probably don't know each other, do you? You're all connected